Jesus on the cross and he was utterly destitute? And the answer to that is, in one sense, yes. But in another sense, this was a sweet-smelling aroma to God, Ephesians 5:2, the whole way through. Because God saw, as he was pouring out his wrath on his son, he saw a perfectly obedient son saying, yes, Father, I agree, I receive this. And that submission for the Father's glory made the Father very glad. So a second difference is this Father is delighting in his Son. Thirdly, God did this for our good. He's pursuing a purpose of love in the suffering of his Son. And fourthly, he's going to raise him from the dead in 3 days. He's not doing this in any kind of long-term damage. In fact, he's not only going to raise him from the dead, he's going to say, therefore, God has highly exalted him and given him a name. So this is a means to the Son's greater glory in the world. So that's 4 that come to my mind. And I'm sure if we just pooled our thoughts right now, we could think of 3 or 4 or 5 others probably. So whenever you hear somebody say that, realize, I thought of an analogy. Okay, here's an analogy. Capital punishment and murder. What if somebody said capital punishment is just murder? He said, this is a very close analogy. Every time you make a comparison between 2 things, it's like this. This is one reality, this is another, and they overlap. And if you want to, you can pick out the overlapping pieces and say ugly things. Like spanking is child abuse. That's because spanking and child abuse have some commonalities. That would be the commonality. And then there are these 8 or 10 big qualifying differences. So whenever you ask a question, how is something like something, you say, okay, I acknowledge that here in this overlapping part is where you are getting your comment. Now, do you realize all of this? And do you realize all of this that's not overlapping? So that's the way I think about a lot of things. Go ahead.
Pastor John, one of the differences in chapter 4 and this version from the last one is where you talked about Paul-type missionaries and Timothy-type missionaries. So in the previous edition, you really hammered the need for Paul-type missionaries. But now you seem to want to say, well, maybe I was selling Timothy-types short a little bit. So could you maybe speak to the role of Timothy-type missionaries in the Great Commission now and if there's a need?
That's an excellent observation. There were other changes in that chapter too. Every time I revise something that's got missionary statistics in it, I feel like, I want to bring this up to speed here, which is why I brought in all that Global South material. But you're pointing out a kind of a mid-course correction. Whenever I celebrate, which I do, and if you haven't, but if you had been around Bethlehem for 30 years, like I have, you will realize that when I came here, this was a very missionary church. I forget how many units we had, maybe 20 or 30 missionary units. And most of them, I would say, were working not among unreached peoples. So they'd be in the Philippines, in Manila, say, with the church, and the church in the Philippines, and this has been 150 years maybe, okay? So the people group is there. I mean, the people group is reached, but the need for missionaries of a Timothy type, maybe I should just say what it is. When I say Paul type missionary, I'm locking in on his statement, I don't want to build on another man's foundation. I want to go where Jesus has not been named. So I'm heading for Spain by way of Rome. That's a frontier missionary, an unreached people's missionary, a Paul. Timothy grew up in Lystra, evidently. Paul finds him there, delights in the qualities that he sees, asks his mom and grandmama, can I have this boy? And they say, all right. I'm just assuming that's what happened. And he starts traveling with him, and he gets deposited in Ephesus as the bishop or pastor there. Now, Ephesus, probably pretty different culturally. than Lystra. Don't know that for sure, but he's not at home anymore. So he moved, like to Manila, okay, or Buenos Aires or whatever. And there he is. And Paul leaves him there, and he doesn't say, you should go to Spain too, because that's where real missionaries go. He doesn't. He said, there's a place for a person to leave their home, go to another metropolitan area who don't have the kind of leadership they need. You're going to be it. Equip the people, and that's your life. And I'm heading for. And so when I wrote the first chapter, I was probably, eager to press Bethlehem forward, press the church forward into unreached peoples, which I still am. And we have made amazing progress in how many of our units here are devoted to unreached peoples. But the last thing I wanted to do, in fact, interestingly, I got an email a few weeks ago, and I haven't answered it yet, from one of our missionaries in Africa, and maybe she'll watch this so she knows that the answer's on the way. And she just asked me that question. She said, can you say something to encourage us who we're not among unreached people here? We're doing this, and this for the good of the church. Nobody else is able to do it, we think, and we think this is God's calling on our life. And I want to say to that couple, that is God's calling on your life. I have zero reason to question God's calling on your life. That's a beautiful and worthy thing. I would like more of our people to do that, not less. When the business as mission group meets here, and they're thinking how to take our businesses and make it more mission-oriented globally, I say, just bless you. Don't feel like, I'm not working really, as a frontier missionary among unreached people. So behind that new was probably an effort. Lord, I don't want to make these folks feel like second-class citizens. Everybody, if anybody should feel second-class citizen, I should be one, right? I'm here and I'm not there. Who am I to say it's better to be in, Afghanistan among unreached people than to be in Africa among reached people doing a unique and necessary work? Biblically, they're both valuable. Yeah, Daniel.
Pastor John, on Monday of last week, you wrote a blog post regarding the tornadoes that had gone through the Midwest. And in your summary, third to last paragraph, you talked about tornadoes being Jesus's. You said that the tornadoes belong to Jesus, and then you closed the last paragraph with this statement: before Jesus took any life in rural America, he gave his own on the rugged cross. And I had some pushback personally just last week regarding your statement there, using the active language. Jesus took this, which I would totally agree with. And then your balance of that with the cross I thought was great. I'm wondering pastorally, as you, maybe even sharing an anecdote that might be helpful, as you hold these truths about the fame of God, God's pleasure in his fame, God's pleasure in bruising the Son, is it helpful at all, do you find, to hold that truth kind of back a little bit when tragedy strikes, and to talk about God's pleasure in abolishing sin, abolishing death, or God's displeasure in anything? Is that helpful? What would you say?
Excellent. It is helpful. And you do measure what you say according to the person you're saying it to and the situation they're in. God's truths are like a medicine cabinet, and there are different medicines for different seasons. There's an anti-nausea medicine, and there's a headache medicine, and there's a Tums for heartburn, and there's just all kinds of things in the cabinet. And you don't pull out the wrong medicine for the, I'll avoid the word disease for grief, but the wrong condition. And so, in general, the answer is yes. Here's one of the things that guides me. I regularly, meaning once or twice a year maybe, do something like I did in that blog, and I'm watching for occasions when it would be appropriate to do it. And I ask the Lord now, I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, I always do. Is this the time, and should I do it? And on this one, I was just blown away by towns that disappeared. And 90 tornadoes in one afternoon. a few days. And, I mean, it wasn't, 38 people is a lot of people to lose, but it's not 3,000. But there was something about it that took me. So I said, okay. And the reason I choose to address it, and this is pastoral counsel here, is that for my church here, I want them at points where they haven't just lost a child, just lost a husband, just been told they had cancer. I want them to be thinking about the providence of God and the sovereignty of God in suffering when they're not suffering. I just think over the years, what you want to do in your church is generally help your people get ready to suffer. Build into your people solid pillars and foundations of faith in the sovereignty of God, so that when you walk into the hospital room, you don't have to rehearse all that theology. I've often said to Tom Steller, I haven't recently, but we used to, when it was just kind of he and I here, not too many other staff, I used to say, you know, Tom, if we make it to the end together, and maybe we will, one of us is going to visit the other in the hospital for the last time. And you know what's going to be so great about that? We won't have to say a word to know exactly what the other is thinking. We will say something, but we won't need to. That's the way I want to walk into Betty Fast's hospital room, which I did last week. Stroke, she had been flourishing. She was old, 86, but she was well. Her family said she had been happier than she'd been. She was going to things at the nursing home. She was just really happy, and bang, in the middle of the night, her brain's taken out. Never recovers. She dies at 5 o'clock the next afternoon. And yet we're all gathered around her. I didn't need to say too much about a theology of death or what's about to happen or what God just did. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. John Fast, down at my side here, he knows that. And he knows what I believe, and we're just, there's such a deep, sweet, theological resting place at those moments. What you can talk about is the more tender things. It is not tender to say, God killed my mom. I mean, the word kill has such a negative connotations, like harshness and meanness and anger, and yet that's what the Bible says God did to David's child that Bathsheba bore him. Killed him. Maybe the last thing to say is, pastorally, I